Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. It's been a while since I've done one of these, mainly because, as I've mentioned in the past, I occasionally do live theater here in town, and I was pretty tied up in a production for the last couple of months. I kept up with some videos for most of the production, but the actual performances kept me pretty busy, and it's taken a little while to get back into the swing of things. I apologize for my prolonged absence, but you're not really here for me. You're here for a new piece of independent fiction, and I have just that. The Black Crown by John A. Douglas is the first book in the Age of Adventures, which is a lot of interesting things at once. First of all, this is the setup for what looks like a longer series. Maybe not fully interconnected and closely knit with a really strong continuity, because, as we're going to talk about more, this book is in large part a series of vignettes with a clear through line to them, admittedly, but nevertheless something that could have been handled as a series of shorter installments, short stories, a couple of novellas, or even one or two short novels that fleshed out these adventures a little bit more, but that Douglas has chosen to kind of tie together in a single work. The stories themselves revolve around Ragoth, or Rags to his friends. Rags is the son of the Queen of Namaria, which is one of the nations united under the Crown Pantheon, and the only nation ruled by humans. However, Rags is not the son of the King of Namaria. He is actually the son of an orc war chief. This puts Rags in an understandably difficult position, and eventually he leaves home because things there go pretty badly for him. Once on the run, he gathers some trustworthy companions. Cortland, the human farmer who aspires to be a knight. Deneth, an elf who is dedicated to works of service and humility in the name of his god. Valmora, a Minotaur warrior who has gone through previous wars and is somewhat jaded at this point. And a number of other people he just bumps into on the road for a day or two. So as you might have guessed, The Black Crown is something of a road trip story. And while the most important thing about a road trip is generally the things that happen along the way, your ultimate destination is kind of important. And for Rags, it's particularly important because he is headed to Dreadmore, the ancestral home of the orcs, in order to meet his father's people. Along the way, he will deal with intrigue and egos, magic and mayhem, accidents and prophecies, friends and traitors. And if that sounds exactly like what you would expect from a work of epic fantasy, I got news for you. The Black Crown is not aspiring to be anything other than that. And that is perfectly fine. In fact, I think that's one of the biggest strengths and one of the biggest weaknesses of the story. The Black Crown very much wants to tell a classic fun adventure story. And I have no problem with that. I quite enjoyed most of The Black Crown, even though it does meander a little bit, as road trips tend to do, and even though sometimes it felt a bit like we were missing the forest for the trees. The characters were charming, their interactions with each other were quite authentic, and the various situations that they ran into each served to illuminate and build up the characters in our minds so that we understood them a little bit better with every passing day, with every town, with every encounter on the road. It is a very competently told story in a very well-known genre. And if you've been listening to this and asking yourself, but what sets it apart? What makes it really special and worthy of my time? You're probably not going to enjoy this book a great deal, because Douglas doesn't seem to have set out to do anything particularly special, with one exception, and I'm going to get to that. But by and large, The Black Crown is just a celebration of your standard fantasy adventure. And if it doesn't put a little smile on your face to know that the protagonists have to outfight some bandits and outsmart a dragon in order to get where they're going, maybe this isn't the story for you. There's nothing wrong with that. I do tend to smile a little bit when I hear that's a part of your fantasy story, and those parts of The Black Crown really appealed to me. The one part of The Black Crown that really didn't appeal to me is the introduction of a typical fantasy story element that Douglas then goes on to subvert. And I don't think it's a bad thing to try and subvert elements of a fantasy story. I could see a number of ways where this particular subversion could have been quite interesting. I just don't think that Douglas handled it very well in his particular story. I don't want to say much more about it here while I'm avoiding spoilers, but there is going to be a little bit of critique and feedback in the second half of this video where I'm going to talk about it a bit more. For now, just know that there is exactly one fantasy trope in this story that I think is really truly subverted. Some people might say that the way Douglas chooses to handle orcs is also a subversion. Frankly, Warcraft has been around so long and handled this idea of the savage but powerful, tribal orc with their own sense of honor based on combat and glory for long enough that I don't consider it a subversion of orcs anymore. I just consider it a subgenre of them. But if you want to look at it that way, there are two subversions in the Black Crown that I think are really applicable here. But for my mileage, there's only one. And again, I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is because it would be a spoiler. I think you could have handled this really well. It could have been an interesting and compelling element. I personally feel, though, that at the time in the story where it comes, and with the way it is introduced and resolved, it's not the most interesting thing here. Unfortunately, with the way it was handled, I actually found the introduction of this particular fantasy trope, and more importantly, its subversion, to be one of the big negative points of the book. I personally don't think that subversion is inherently negative, and while I don't like its use in this story, I don't think it's a deal breaker. The story is still very entertaining, the characters are likable, and the adventure is for the most part quite engaging. If you're the kind of person who hears subversion and just puckers up in sheer distaste, this may not be the story for you. However, if you are a fan of epic fantasy, if you're not looking for something that has to break the mold, and if the subversion of a typical story trope doesn't cause an allergic reaction in you, The Black Crown is probably worth checking out. If you're on the fence, and you want to know a little bit more, if you don't mind a couple of things being spoiled, well, I'm about to talk a little bit more about the use of a particular writing technique, namely subversion, and it will spoil a plot point in this story. That may help you decide whether you are interested or not. Likewise, if you've read this story and you're interested in hearing a little bit about how techniques could possibly be better implemented in a story, stay tuned, because we're about to talk about the prophecy. So, dear viewer, what you need to understand, if you haven't already read The Black Crown, is that when Rags flees from his family, he is warned by a person he trusts that he was implicated in a prophecy, that there is some kind of Lord of Shadow who is riding a great black dragon and is plotting to overthrow the Crown Pantheon, plunge the continent into darkness. Rags is the only one who can stop it. You can see where this is going, right? This is a very common chosen one kind of a trope. Rags has a sword shoved into his hands by the person who tells him this, and then they go to hold off the Dark One, sacrificing themselves so Rags can get away. He's warned not to tell anyone about this, and he keeps it a secret from his traveling companions, none of whom are present when this takes place, and Rags sets out for Dreadmoor. This is the trope that gets subverted. Surprise, surprise. This kind of trope is, as I said, very common, both played straight and subverted in one way or another. In the case of the Black Crown, it proves to be just another layer of deception to convince Rags to run away from home and keep him out of the hair of his contemptuous step-family. His stepfather doesn't like him, his step-siblings by and large don't like him, and while his mother does love him, she doesn't have total control over the court and what they think. So Rags is quickly disposed of using this gambit, but he doesn't know it at the time, and neither do we as the audience. He doesn't learn about it till he gets to Dreadmoor, and he meets his uncles who make it perfectly clear that he's not a part of any kind of a prophecy, nor was any black dragon, dark wizard, demon lord kind of character a part of the orc wars that were fought in the years before Rags was born. Okay, trope, subversion. There you go. So, what overall is my issue with it? The big issue with it is the way it's revealed. Well, that's not the only big issue with it. My other big issue with it is it was painfully obvious to me that Rags was not a prophesied person with a dark wizard or demon lord chasing him, because we never saw the dark wizard or the demon lord in the story, nor did we see anything that could really conceivably be the shadow of the Demon Lord cast over Rags. The fake prophecy that Rags is given and the timing of it makes it very believable that Rags would never talk about it with other people, and that he would interpret some of the mundane actions taking place around him, the guards, the armies he sees, things like that, as evidence of the prophecy. But on the whole, the lack of constant interference by agents of this looming evil made it pretty obvious to me after about a third of the book that they were not actually a part of Rags' story, whatever it may be. So I can't say this twist really shocked me when it was revealed. It more made me say, yeah, that pretty much makes sense. Something was off about that whole situation, even if I didn't know what exactly it was. My problem with it is the timing of the reveal, and the rather abrupt response that Rags has to it. See, Rags does not have the deception revealed to him by the person who deceived him. He has it revealed to him by a person utterly unconnected to that deception. And then, instead of having to respond to it immediately, revealing some new aspect of his character, which is the way Rags has had to deal with most of his problems throughout this story, rather than bringing back some previously established aspect of Rags' character to inform his response to this, rather than really seeing anything at all immediately in response to this deception, we kind of get nothing for probably 4 or 5 pages, a whole chapter even. And it does something really terrible. It kills the forward momentum of the story, rather than pushing the story forward. Here's the thing. There is a concept that is very important in storytelling called tension. And while it was very obvious to me from relatively early in the story that Rags did not have some prophesied destiny in front of him, the tension caused by wondering what exactly was the nature of this false prophecy, what exactly it was going to prompt him to do, continued to pull me forward. And there was some tension in the dramatic irony, that it was pretty clear to me Rags had no prophesied fate, but he was still trying to carry out this prophecy. These things were very interesting. They built intrigue. They built insight into his character. And when that thread was cut, when it was subverted and removed from the weave of the story, all that tension was lost. And I didn't have any place to hang all those questions, all those insights for quite some time. And I actually had a hard time getting back into the story after that thread was cut. It wasn't clear to me where Rags was going now, and he was separated from just about all of the context that he had been built into so far. He was pretty much alone. Deneth was still with him, but they were separated by the rest of the orcs who wouldn't allow them to talk to each other very much. He believed Cortland was dead, and Valmora had finished her job and just said, "Good luck to you, kid," and gone her own way. I believe John A. Douglas intended this as kind of a second act low point for Rags. However, second act low points generally occur when a character has something they really need or want, but they don't know how they're going to go about getting it, and all the things arrayed against them seem insurmountable. This revelation comes about, and Rags doesn't know what he wants, and he just seems lost for a bit. And as a result, the story flounders. It just seems to lose all direction for a bit. And then we go off in a completely new direction. It almost feels like the story restarts. I mentioned before that the Black Crown could have been a couple or even several smaller stories, and if it had been formatted that way, if the reveal that Rags had sunk all this time and effort into a false prophecy had been the end of one story, and then a new one had begun, I think it would have been pretty good, actually. But that's not what the Black Crown is. It is presented as a single story. And I actually reached this point in the story, and I had a hard time summoning up the motivation to continue reading for about a week and a half. Now, as I said in my broader review, by no means is this a bad idea. I just think the execution leaves a little bit to be desired. The use of this particular plot point would have been a lot better if it was done at some time when Rags had access to all of his friends and allies, to more quickly bring him back on point, push him forward in a new, somewhat adjusted direction, and keep us, the audience, rolling on that journey of discovery, of of character growth, of adventure. But that's not possible because Rags is separated from all his allies at the time he gets this revelation. Alternatively, he could have had this revelation at the climax of the book rather than at the second act low point, so that when the ground is pulled out from under him, we can immediately see that he has found something new in his allies and friends, or that he has found something new in opposing the villains of the story, or he has found something new in his dedication to his people, the orcs. And in the final clash of power, skills, and ideas, when the villains try and undercut his morale by telling him he's been living a lie all this time, he can immediately come back and assert, no, maybe this prophecy you gave me is a lie, but the friendships I found along the way, the things we have dedicated ourselves to since then, these are still real, and then, we can go on and fulfill the rest of the climactic confrontation. And then you can go on and you can deal with some of the fallout of that, maybe some of the self-doubt, some of the realignment of priorities in the next book. But that's not what we get here. We get kind of this second act low point that just seems to spin the story out and bring everything to a stop. It's a good idea, but not a great execution. And I'm pretty forgiving of it. It is John A. Douglas's first book. First books are always a little bit rough. And by no means is The Black Crown a perfect book. Outside of this, I think, most scenes are a little bit too long. It could probably afford to cut a little bit of description here, a little bit of dialogue there, keep the pace a little bit snappier. That's a very subjective thing, of course. But I think most first-time authors could always benefit from going back and looking at those things. But the biggest, most ambitious thing that John A. Douglas tries in this story is this plot twist with the false prophecy. And I think it's important to try these big kinds of things, and it's equally important to give good, solid feedback on those kinds of big, ambitious ideas. It's my hope that Douglas will continue to play around with these big, ambitious ideas, but hopefully in a way that serves the narrative tension, the progress of his characters, and the overall drive of his story a little bit better. Will I pick up the second Age of Adventures book? I think that's something I'll decide once I see the blurb for it. But in the meantime, let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.